on an exam, okay, or on a quiz question. So the parasympathetic nervous system pathway includes a blank preganglionic neuron, okay? So is that one going to be short or long? Do you remember? Which one? Yeah, which one? How many say short? Okay, how many say long? Okay, how many don't say anything? They're not sure. Yeah, a couple of you. Yeah, okay. Yeah, so let me just kind of show you all the answers here so we can kind of write them in. And so we've got a long preganglionic neuron, okay? And then we've got C here that releases blank. So it's going to release acetylcholine. That one's pretty simple, okay? And then, yeah, you guys can't see that yet. I'm going to write these in and then I'll bring it right back. And so then we've got I, A, C, H. Okay, let me go back to the Zoom screen so we can see that. There we go. So we've got a PNS pathway includes a long preganglionic neuron, okay? And then it's that second one that's the short one, right? A lot of times it's just embedded right in the postganglionic neuron. A lot of times the one that's embedded right in the target tissue that it's going to control. Okay, that's going to release acetylcholine, that's C. Okay, bind to a blank kind of receptor, so that's I. So nicotinic is the first one. Okay, that's the first type. And remember, nicotinic cholinergic. Anytime you see that cholinergic, that's when we're talking about the parasympathetic nervous system, or we're at least talking about acetylcholine. Most likely that's parasympathetic. There is an example of the sympathetic used there too that was in the notes, which stimulates a short postganglionic neuron. Okay, that releases acetylcholine again. So it's always acetylcholine. That makes it easy on the parasympathetic side, which will bind to a muscarinic, now cholinergic receptor. Okay, so it's nicotinic first, muscarinic second. It's just something you just do kind of have to remember those different, the order of things there. Okay, all right, any questions on that one? Okay, all right, so before we keep going with those notes, let's take a quick look at what we got for the week, this week. Okay, so no lab this week because we don't have class Wednesday, which doesn't really matter for this section, but a lot of the other labs from other sections happen on Wednesday. So that's why we don't have lab this week. Okay, so we don't have to worry about that. Master and AMP due right now. Hopefully that's already done. We got a lecture quiz. Oh, I can't write on there, but you can see that lecture quiz number 4 is due Friday. Okay, and that one is going to be over the female reproductive system that we're doing today, and then over the heart anatomy and histology notes. And that's actually what we cover on Friday, okay? I'll post that video today, so you'll have that. You can watch it whenever you want. That's a recorded lecture day. But I don't normally have the stuff on Friday on the quiz, but that's just the way it worked out this time. So just so you're aware of that. But again, you can watch that whenever you want. You don't have to wait till Friday to watch out. It'll be up today, okay? So that's what we got going this week. Just so you know, looking ahead, week 6, you can see over there on the left, exam 2 already is there, okay? So it keeps coming in this class, okay? So it keeps coming quick. So you got to stay ahead, got to stay on it. If you do want to talk to me about your exam 1 at all, other students have already met with me on Zoom and I can talk to you about which ones you got wrong, which ones you need to work on, things like that. So happy to do that. Just sign up for one of those office hours appointments and I'd be happy to do that. But I don't show the exams. I don't give you access to the exams for the reason that I don't want them getting out there and getting circulated and have to make a brand new exam every time. It's a lot of work making those hybrid questions, so I don't make brand new exams every time. So I don't show those to you. Okay, but if you do want to talk about yours specifically, then just sign up for one of those office hours appointments. I'm happy to go through with you and let you know which ones you missed, where you did well, where you need to keep working on stuff. And one point of that is because the final is cumulative for the whole semester, right? So you might want to know, all right, I really didn't know the eyeball very well at all, right? That I really messed up on the eye. So for the final, I got to make sure I study the eye well, right? But besides that, there's not really like another reason for right now, except just to kind of know what you got wrong. But really it is important for the final because we're going to get back into all that stuff for the final. Okay, and there's study guides posted for all the exams now in the modules right underneath where you'll see the exam. You can see it right there under week 6 study guide for exam 2. So you'll see that all the way up through the final as well. Okay. All right. So any questions for you guys on Zoom or anybody here in the class about what the rest of this week looks like or what we got coming up? Okay, yeah, feel free to put a question in the chat there if you have one, but if not, then we'll go ahead and hop over to the notes for the day. All right. Okay, so today we're going to dive into the female side of the reproductive system. And again, the anatomy as well as the physiology. We'll spend the last part of the class looking at the menstrual cycle and the different fluctuations in hormones that occur and kind of purpose for those fluctuations. And so, yeah, so let's dive right into that. So the ovaries are the female equivalent to the testes in the male, so we talked about. Let me make this a little bit bigger so you guys can see it. And they are, these are what contain gametes. These are protected by the tunica albuginea, that the same name of the structure that we found in the testes, right? That kind of white membranous structure that kind of protects the gametes, okay? So the cells that we have within the ovaries are the gametes themselves. So these are the egg cells, the ova, the oocytes, different names, all mean the same thing. Okay, there's also nurse cells, which are called granulosa cells. And these are all organized into what's known as a follicle. Okay, and so what that means by a follicle is kind of like this big sac. Okay, so they kind of surround the egg cell. Okay, so it's really this cavity that encompasses the egg. All right, and so these are all around the egg to help it develop. Okay, so very similar to the Sertoli cells that we talked about in the testes. Okay, so there's many of these cells for each and every egg cell, whereas in males it was one Sertoli cell per sperm cell. Or sorry, for many sperm, it's just the opposite. Okay, and then one of the other main jobs of these cells, this is the primary source of estrogen in females. This is where the primary source of estrogen is. Who hasn't got the sign-in sheet yet? Anybody in class? Yep, let me just pass it forward there. Logan, thank you. A bunch of people up front haven't got it yet. Okay, and then we have what's called the fecal cells, and these are kind of between the follicles. Okay, the function of these is to secrete something called androstenedione. This is another one of those androgens that we talked about before. Okay, androgens are precursors to the sex hormones, either testosterone or estrogen, and so these can be turned into estrogen. Okay, and there's some really cool little images. This is kind of an image here of what the uterus would look like in the middle, with the ovaries kind of on the outside, and with the fallopian tubes. And you can kind of see one part that I'm not going to play the video today, but there's a little video I've played in the past, where one thing to note here is that the fallopian tubes, also known as the uterine tubes, are not actually connected to the ovaries, right? So the ovaries are going to release an egg, right, during ovulation, and that egg's got to get into this fallopian tube, make its way down into the uterus, right? But they're not actually connected, okay? And so actually what happens is when ovulation happens, the ovaries are releasing chemicals that actually draw the fallopian tube towards it, and it looks like a little claw, right? It's got these little fingers that kind of reaches out, grabs onto the egg, and then the egg's able to pass down in. So there is a slight chance that sometimes that egg actually goes somewhere else. It goes into the abdominal cavity, in really what's called the peritoneal cavity. And there's very rare cases where actually an egg can get fertilized and get into the wrong spot as well. And you can have what's called an ectopic pregnancy, right? Where those don't end up in a successful pregnancy, but it can be dangerous for the mom if the baby's growing in the wrong spot, right? It's not going to grow for very long, but still can be a dangerous thing for mom. So makes kind of sense why now when you understand that those two structures aren't connected all the time. They actually have to come and grab onto that egg in order to get it. So any questions about that so far? Okay. All right, so with those uterine tubes, also known as fallopian tubes or oviducts, they're only about 4 inches long, Okay, and again, not continuous with the ovaries. The clinical significance of that is what I was just talking about. This is what can lead to ectopic pregnancy or peritoneal infections. That peritoneal cavity is that space kind of around the uterus, around the ovaries. If certain substances make their way up through the fallopian tubes and exit out into that space, infections can occur. Okay, so there's different layers of that. The most inner layer is columnar epithelium. Okay, so the function of that is to move the egg. So you might remember in the histology section from last semester, ciliated or columnar epithelial tissue typically has cilia, and those little cilia are beating, and that's actually helping to move the egg downwards towards the uterus, which makes it harder for the sperm to actually swim up that way because the cilia are moving the fluid down that way. The sperm are swimming upstream, literally, because the ciliar job is to move the egg down, but the sperm are going against that current. Okay, and then there's a smooth muscle layer. Again, it can contract and kind of push the egg towards the uterus. And then again, it can move to actually go towards the ovaries and catch those eggs. Okay, but the fertilization process where the egg and the sperm actually meet typically almost always happens inside of these tubes, not in the uterus, but somewhere inside of these tubes. Okay. All right, so the other major structure here to talk about is the uterus. Okay, and the uterus has these similar layers. At least the inner and the middle layers are similar. So the inner layer is what's known as the endometrium. Okay, endometrium is a mucous membrane. It's very well vascularized. Okay, so lots and lots of blood vessels, lots and lots of glands. Okay, and this goes through constant stages of development where it builds up and gets thicker and thicker and thicker. And then stages of necrosis, which just means dying tissue, where it dies off and sloughs that tissue off. And that's really the contents of menstruation is the endometrium. Okay, and this is all driven by hormones. And so this really serves the function of being the site of implantation. Once that egg and sperm meet up, it gets implanted in the endometrium. Okay, and then there's a middle layer here, and that middle layer is known as the myometrium. So myo means muscle. Okay, so this is the muscular part of it. Okay, this is by far the majority of the bulk of the uterus. Right, this is made up of smooth muscle, and the fibers are not all in one line. They're not all parallel to each other. They're actually all going in different angles, right? Because that actually helps the uterus to literally kind of turn itself inside out when it needs to push that baby out, right? It can pull from all different angles and just totally just create a lot of force, a lot of pressure, and push that baby through the birth canal. Okay, so push that baby out. Okay, so we got the endometrium. This is the most internal layer. Excuse me. And we got the myometrium. It's that middle layer of muscle. And then the outer layer is the perimetrium. And the perimetrium is a serous membrane. We talked about those a little bit last semester. We'll talk about them again in the heart. It's a double layered membrane that has a fluid filled space on the inside. Really good for any organs that move around a lot because it cuts down on friction. Okay, so let's take a second. And I want you guys to go ahead and label those different structures that we just talked about. And I'd love for you to answer this question here on the app. And let's go ahead and do a quick, send you guys your breakout rooms, you guys on Zoom. And yeah, a couple of you will be you guys will be with different people than you're used to being with a couple of you, okay? And so you guys in class, go ahead and just fill this out. And once you get done, go ahead and talk to the person next to you and make sure you got the same answers. All right, the app should be open now for you to send in your answer there. Where's this? Which one is the site of conception? All right, guys, so you're sending in your answer on the app there. Say that again.
Like what's the, like these are all like endo is usually like inner, but like what's like the second like
Oh, the metrium part? Yeah, I don't know what that root word means. Yeah, I'll look that up though. It's a good question. You could look it up real quick on your phone. Google it for me. Just do like a root word, metrium. Yeah. It's probably something to do with the uterus, but I don't know. All right, guys, everybody coming back on Zoom there, go ahead and just send in that answer on your app, just for that question there, which is the site of conception. For womb? Oh, perfect. Perfect, thank you. All right, anybody else there in the app? Send in your answer. Everybody's back. Okay, I'll leave it open for just a sec, make sure we get everybody. 68, that's almost everybody. 70, yeah, that's getting close. Okay, so we're somewhere between A and E, but about 2/3 of you are saying E there. So, so let's look at those. So A is the most internal part, right? So A, B, and C are the three layers of the uterus, right? So A is the endometrium, B is the myometrium, and then C would be the parametrium, okay? And then D is the ovary, right? So that's where the eggs are housed for the majority of their life. And then just when they're released during ovulation, then they end up over into E, which is the uterine tube or that fallopian tube. And that's where conception is typically occurring, right? That's where the sperm and the egg usually meet up, is somewhere inside of that tube. Okay. All right, any questions on this anatomy here before we move on? Okay, any questions for you guys on Zoom? We good? Give me a thumbs up if you're still with us. Good, good to see those thumbs. All right, let's keep going. Okay, all right, so let's dive into the more of the external female anatomy here. So the vagina is mostly smooth muscle and mucous membrane. Okay, so it's lined by mucous membrane, mostly stratified squamous epithelial tissue. Okay, remember that was one of the two examples we gave of stratified squamous epithelial tissue. There was the skin and there was the lining of the vagina. Okay, so the hymen is the outermost portion of this mucous membrane, and this before early in a female before sexual intercourse, or sometimes it can happen in other ways as well. But this pretty much completely blocks the opening of the vagina, and there may be some bleeding that occurs when that first breaks. Okay, so the functions of the vagina, obviously, sexual intercourse, passageway for menstrual flow, and birth canal. Okay, and then the external structures that we'll see there on the next slide. So the clitoris is erectile tissue, very similar to the setup in the penis that we talked about last time, or we talked about last Wednesday. So that vascular anatomy is almost the same. Okay, so erection occurs via parasympathetic nervous system, just like in males. And then there's the labia majora and labia minora. These are skin folds that provide protection for the vagina and the urethra. Okay, and then there's the vestibular glands, which are behind the labia. There's a bunch of different ones, just kind of clump them all together for the purposes of this class. But they have the job of secreting lubricating fluid before intercourse as well as during intercourse. Okay, give you a sec to finish writing that down. All right, and if you're done writing that down, you can go to the next slide and start labeling that diagram. Okay. All right, so there's the diagram there. I'm going to go ahead and open up the app for a numeric question. And so I'm going to answer that question there. Which number is similar to the bulbourethral gland in males? Okay, there's some corresponding structures in male and female anatomy. Those glands are one of them. So go ahead and fill this in, label this, and then turn to the person next to you. Make sure you're on the same page with that, as well as the question there that you're going to answer. Thank you. A couple of people not get the sign-in sheet yet? Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right, so you're sending that in on the chat or on the app there. So just send in that number. Which number is similar to the bulbourethral gland in males? Got it? Huh? Wait, I'm sorry, yet. Yeah, so double check with the person next to you, see if you're on the same page with the labeling. Thank you. All right, anybody else? Looks like there's about 5 of you that haven't responded yet. I'm going to shut it off in about 5 seconds. One thing to note on the anatomical setup here, this is a different view where you're kind of looking from a superior view. You can see the setup of the bladder, which is right here, right? And then the uterus right there. So have you ever heard of, have you ever talked to a pregnant woman that says, I just have to pee all the time, right? I never, I pee and then immediately a few minutes later, I got to pee again, right? Well, it kind of makes sense if you look at that setup, right? I mean, literally as that uterus grows, it's just pinching the bladder up against the pelvis, right? And there's already not much space for it if you look at it there. So you can just imagine that uterus gets bigger and bigger and bigger. The bladder just shrinks down to almost nothing. So makes sense when you look at it that way. Okay, let's see what you guys said here. All right, so we're kind of split here between 1, 4, and 6, it looks like. And then, yeah, so let's walk through that. So number 1 there is the clitoris. So you can see it in a couple different places. Up on the top left is with the skin all intact, and then the bottom was with the skin removed. Okay, and so then 2 and 3 are, so 2 is the labia majora, 3 is the labia minora. And so you can't see the glands very well on this image, but the bottom one you can see them better. You can just kind of see the holes where they release their fluids in the top one. Okay, so 4 is the external urethral orifice, so that's where the urethra exits. Okay, so one major difference between males and females in reproductive anatomy is there's no shared space between the urinary system and the reproductive system in females as there is in males, right? There was some of the tubing that was shared in males, but in females it's not. Okay, and then number 5 is the hymen, in that case ruptured, and 6 you can see kind of it's where all those glands kind of release through these little holes here, and then you can just see all the different vestibular glands there. And so 6 would be the answer to this. And again, as you can see, there's a bunch of different ones, but for the purpose of this class, just kind of lump them all together. They have all very similar functions. Okay, any questions about that? Either on the Zoom crew or here in class? Okay. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the process of the development of the eggs. And so just how we talked about spermagenesis, right, or spermatogenesis, we have oogenesis here in females. And so the mitotic part, or the mitosis part, again, this is when we're adding more cells, right? Mitosis adds more cells that are going to stay there. And that's mitosis of these stem cells, or the oogonium cells, only occurs during fetal life. Okay, so during fetal life, females are increasing the stem cell population up to about 6 to 7 million of these stem cells that can then produce eggs. Okay, but this stops sometime right before birth. Okay, and then meiosis begins after that, and then meiosis will start right before birth, and then all of those eggs are just stuck in meiosis 1 until ovulation happens. Okay, so some can stay paused in this stage of meiosis for 50 years, and some of them, most of them, are never actually recruited for ovulation. Right? Okay, so this idea of atresia in females is just really the idea that there's an always decreasing number of egg cells in females throughout lifetime. Okay, and many of the eggs die along the way. Okay, and there's no stem cells left to replace those, so it's just kind of this number that's falling. So it's really typically only somewhere around 300 to 500 egg cells that are ovulated throughout a woman's lifetime. But the kind of thinking, or at least there's some myths around the idea that that's when you hit menopause, is when you run out of eggs. But it's not the case. Women typically have way more eggs than they're ever going to need to ovulate. So it's not that. It's typically more related to loss of ovary function than it is a loss of the eggs themselves. Okay. All right, so this just kind of walks us through the process of the development of the follicle as well as of the eggs. Okay, so there's only a couple structures I really want you to know exactly what they are here. Number one is what the mature follicle looks like, and then number two is what the corpus luteum is. Okay, so this is the follicle when it's in its earliest stage, just a thin layer around the egg. Okay, and then you can see as it goes through development, it grows more and more follicle, right? It gets thicker and thicker and thicker. Okay, and as we'll talk about in a second, the source of estrogen is those follicle cells, right? So it makes sense that as a woman is moving towards ovulation, estrogen levels are rising as well, right? Because that's the source of the estrogen, is those cells that are dividing and that follicle thickening. You can see eventually it kind of turns into this, and so this one here is really what the mature follicle looks like, a Graafian follicle. Okay, and then this would be ovulation here, right? So ovulation is when the egg leaves, and then so what we're left over with after ovulation is what's known as the corpus luteum. Okay, and that really just means yellow body. Okay, and it's not just kind of this thing that doesn't have any function. It's actually has many important functions. This is the primary source of progesterone in females, and it kind of just becomes an endocrine organ, endocrine tissue that kind of keeps the endometrium alive in case implantation happens. Okay, so the Graafian follicle is in step 4. Corpus luteum is really step 6 there. So remember the name of LH? What did LH stand for, that hormone? Luteinizing hormone, right? Its job is to cause ovulation, so it forms the corpus luteum. That's why it's called that, because it luteinizes the follicle, right? It creates the corpus luteum by causing the egg to leave, and then what's left over is that corpus luteum. Okay. Any questions on that? Okay, and you don't worry about so much that. It's really the things I pointed out already are what you need to know, so don't worry about jotting all that down. It is all right in your book if you want to look at that, but I've given you the important part that you need to know there. Okay, so let's talk about the female sex hormones here. So LH, like we were just talking about, luteinizing hormone, its job here is to stimulate those thecal cells or those interstitial cells to produce androstenedione. Okay, so it's one of the sources of estrogen, but it's not the primary source. This is the androgen that gets converted into estrogen. Okay, so that's one of the roles of LH here. Follicle stimulating hormone, again, gets its name for what it does in the females, not in males, okay? Its job is to stimulate that follicle to grow. All right, so if we go back to this slide, all the way from here, where there's just a little tiny follicle, all the way up down to here where there's this huge follicle, that's all the work of follicle stimulating hormone, right? It causes those cells to divide and to grow. Okay, also stimulates those granulosa cells, the ones that make up the follicle, to release estrogen. Okay, so again, it makes sense that that the more of those granulosa cells you have, as the follicle gets bigger, then the more estrogen is released. Okay, also inhibin is involved in this, just like it is in the males. Okay, estrogen, again, released from the follicle in response to FSH, stimulates growth in the endometrium in the uterus. Okay, so the estrogen's big role here, as far as the reproductive system goes, is to cause that endometrium to grow and to get ready for implantation in case pregnancy does happen. Okay, progesterone, as I said, is primarily released from the corpus luteum, so after ovulation occurs. And its job is to keep that endometrium alive in case implantation occurs. Okay, and then inhibin has that negative feedback role for FSH. And GnRH, this was the hypothalamic one that you don't need to know. Comes from the hypothalamus, but you don't need to remember the name of that one. Okay, so let's take a second. I'm going to send you to your breakout rooms again, and I want you guys to talk about this similar to what we did in the males. I'd like you to fill in these hormones here, and then answer this question here. Okay, there was most of the time we have negative feedback, but I did give a couple examples of when positive feedback happens in the menstrual cycle. Positive feedback does occur at some point, and at some point there's so much estrogen release. Estrogen normally is causing negative feedback to this whole system, but at some point when there's enough estrogen, it actually flips to cause the hypothalamus and the pituitary to release more FSH and LH, and so that's positive feedback, and that leads us right up to ovulation. Okay, so chat about this in your breakout rooms for a second. You guys in the room, fill this in, but just right away, go ahead and turn to the person behind you and just start working through this together, where everything should go here. And then I'll open up that question on the app.
So it comes from the anterior pituitary gland. Yeah, the granulus cells release.
All right, so you guys are sending in the answer to that question up in the top right there. Where do we see that positive feedback from estrogen? All right, send in your answer there. Give you about 15 seconds if you haven't sent that in yet. Please send it in the number. All right, a couple more people send it in. Anybody else? We got 2 more people, I think. Send in your answer there. Let's see what you guys said for this question. Yeah, okay, so about half of you are saying 5, and then about a quarter saying 4. So yeah, so we'll get to that part here in a second. Let's walk through the first parts first. Okay, so number 1, again, we don't need to know the name of that hormone, but that's the hypothalamic hormone, right? It's GnRH. You don't have to know the name of it, but GnRH is released from the hypothalamus, right? That one causes the anterior pituitary to release. Which one would be, yeah, what are the 2 hormone names? Just yell them out. LH and FSH. Good, okay. And so we see FSH kind of first here. That's going right to the follicle and doing just what it's named, stimulating the follicle to grow. All right. We see LH released. That's going specifically to the thecal cells of the follicle, causing those to release androgens, right? Or that was that androstenedione that was on the slide. Okay. Those androgens go to these granulosa cells, cause some release of inhibin. So we're getting some negative feedback there. So that's definitely all negative feedback first. Okay. Those androgens then get converted into estrogens. Okay. And then also the follicle itself just releases estrogen, right? Okay, and then so most of the time that estrogen is providing negative feedback here, just like inhibin is. So we get negative feedback. So that just kind of controls the rate of release of the hormone from the hypothalamus and controls the rate of FSH and LH. Okay, but then when that follicle gets huge like this and starts looking like a clown with a purple mole on its nose, then that's kind of funny, huh? But, that's the nucleus of the cell there, the purple mole. But yeah, so when it gets that big, now then there's so much estrogen release, right? That's when it gets converted into positive feedback. Okay, and so it's just something in the way that the hypothalamus and pituitary are programmed to that kind of a small amount, a moderate amount of estrogen will cause negative feedback, kind of control the rate of release of those. But then once it gets to be a lot, then it flips it. And all of a sudden, what does that cause? That causes this huge surge of both LH and FSH. The FSH doesn't matter so much here, but it causes this surge of LH, and then LH is what stimulates the follicle to rupture, and then the egg can be released, right? So that's really what stimulates ovulation, is that flipping from negative feedback to positive feedback with a massive amount of estrogen release, causing LH surge, which causes the follicle to rupture and ovulation. Okay, so yeah, somewhere there, 4 or 5, it doesn't matter that much which one you chose, as long as you understand the concept that it flips to positive feedback. Okay, all right, questions on that? So now ovulation's happened. So then the next step here is the corpus luteum, right? So the corpus luteum is what's left over of the follicle. Now we start seeing more progesterone release. We're still going to see estrogen release, still going to be inhibin release, but it's all coming from the corpus luteum, which is just the follicle without the egg in it. Okay, so that's kind of the overall process, but then the next part here, we're going to dive into how this fits into the different stages of the menstrual cycle. So if you kind of grasp this, then you'll be right ready to understand it in terms of the 28-day menstrual cycle, which we'll dive into next. But any questions on this before we move into that? Okay, all right. Let's do it. So menstrual cycle. So we've standardized it here to 28 days. Most women don't have an exactly 28-day menstrual cycle, but it just kind of makes it make the most sense when we talk about it this way. Okay, and so we're going to talk about each of the phases. And so we'll start out with the menstrual phase. So the menstrual phase is days 1 through 5. And that's the easiest way to kind of know where we're at in the cycle, because that's when the first sign of blood is. Okay, so that's day 1 is the first sign of blood. Okay, so this is right after the corpus luteum dies from the previous cycle, right? And so that corpus luteum was keeping the endometrium alive, right? And so if the corpus luteum isn't there anymore, then the endometrium dies and bleeding starts. And so that's really what happens. There's the corpus luteum dies, that drops the progesterone levels. Progesterone's job was to keep that endometrium alive. And so the endometrium dies. So blood vessels, mucous membrane, this all just starts falling off, okay? And this is the blood loss. And so it's typically somewhere around 30 mils. Obviously, this can vary quite a bit, depending on the woman, depending on their age, lots of different factors. Okay, and so a few things you'll want to know from each stage of the menstrual cycle is, number 1, what days are included in it? Okay, what are kind of the key events going on here? But then also, what are the different hormones looking like at this point, right? Which ones are high, which ones are low, and then what is going on with the egg and the follicle in each one. Okay, so at this stage, all of these GnRH, again the hypothalamic one, FSH and LH, these are all pretty low at this point, but they're starting to rise because progesterone was inhibiting these hormones from being released. But now the progesterone is not there much anymore because the corpus luteum's gone. Now we've started to see a rise in these hormones. Okay, so that's days 1 through 5. Okay, the second part of the cycle here, second stage, is the proliferative phase. Okay, proliferation means to grow, right, or to multiply. Okay, so this is days 5 through 13. Now we're seeing much higher levels of the hormones. Okay, this is recruiting multiple follicles. Okay, I always like to think of this as like the girls on the bench. They want to get in there and play. Okay, there's a few of them. They're like, I'm ready to go, coach. And then only one actually gets called up and gets to play, right? But that's kind of how it is. Multiple follicles, multiple eggs kind of start developing like they're going to be ovulated, but then only one actually gets ovulated each time. And so the follicle will release very low levels of estrogen still at this point, but still starting to rise. Okay, and the thing that's growing, the proliferative part, is the endometrium and the follicle. The follicles are getting bigger, and the endometrium is growing. Okay, so that's the proliferative part, is the endometrium and the follicles are growing. Okay, so it's 5 through 13. Day 14, right in the middle here, this is ovulation. Okay, so the follicle is as big as it's going to be here, very large. So lots and lots of estrogen release. This is when that estrogen flips over to positive feedback because there's so much of it. This leads to a surge of that hypothalamic hormone, which leads to a surge of LH, right? And then that stimulates ovulation. Okay, again, that luteinizing hormone, as I've mentioned a few times. Okay, but then immediately estrogen levels start to plummet after this. Okay, so every woman's cycle is different as far as the way that it affects their mood and things like that. But one of the most common times to have some pretty severe mood swings is shortly after ovulation, because you pretty much have the highest levels of estrogen you're ever going to have, and then as soon as ovulation occurs, they just plummet quickly. So that large disruption in estrogen levels can have some effects on mood. Okay, so then the last stage, fourth stage, is the next 2 weeks. Okay, and this is called either the secretory phase or the luteal phase, depending on whether we're focusing on the endometrium, then it'd be the secretory phase, or if we're focusing on the follicle, then it's the luteal phase, because this is where the corpus luteum is there. Okay, and that's the follicle versus uterine view. This is the most consistent time period of the menstrual cycle. Most women have pretty much a 2-week luteal phase. The other parts are the ones that vary a lot, and that's because that lifespan of the corpus luteum is pretty consistently about 2 weeks. Okay, endometrium is maintained by progesterone release, and because of all that growth in the mucous membrane and the secretion part, so the secretory phase, that mucous membrane is secreting a bunch of mucus. This creates something called the mucus plug. Right? And that mucus plug actually plugs up the entrance from the vagina up to the uterus. Okay, and this is can be a sign of early labor, late in the pregnancy, a mucus plug can come out. It can show up in the toilet or wherever it might show up, and it can be a possible sign that the delivery or the labor is coming. Okay, but this also this is when all the fluid retention occurs. This is when blood flow increases. This is when bloating, those feelings of bloatedness happen because everything is just kind of building up in the endometrium. Okay. Progesterone is being released here by the corpus luteum, and it's inhibiting these other hormones from the hypothalamus and pituitary gland. Okay. All right, so here's what I'd like to do for a few minutes. We've got some time. We're going to send you back to your breakout rooms on Zoom. I'd like you to just go through these next 4 slides here and just fill in what we just talked about, okay? So it's an opportunity to process all this information. So fill in the days with each phase, fill in what's going on with these hormones. All you got to do is say either low or high or rising or falling. Say what's happening in the follicle, what's happening in the uterus. And these ones are all pretty much going to go together, right? They're all going to go in the same way. Okay, so take a couple minutes here and fill in these next 4 slides and spend some time processing this, and then we'll go through it together. Okay, so go ahead. Okay, Caroline, I see you there. I don't remember what team you're on, though, do you, Caroline? What number? 3, thank you. Okay, so turn to somebody next to you and talk through this. Definitely complicated stuff. So spend a little time processing this with a partner. Just remember, as your mask slipped down, just pull it back up for us so you got your nose covered there too. Appreciate it. Happens to me too, but it's a pain, I know.
In the second phase, or the second phase, there's still low levels of estrogen until it switches. Yeah. So, proliferative. And then
I'd love it if everybody had somebody to talk to. I don't have you guys set up in teams like I normally do, so it makes it a little bit harder, but find someone to talk to, guys. Awesome. All right, guys, let's come back together. Everybody's coming back from the breakout rooms. So let's come back together and just walk through this briefly. You'll have an opportunity to, if you don't get to write every single thing down, you'll have an opportunity to do that on the, you can look back on the video afterwards. But so menstrual phase, the days 1 through 5, right? So what's happening with each of those hormones? Again, those 3 are going to all be the same pretty much, right? They're low, but they're starting to rise. okay? Because the progesterone was inhibiting their release, so the progesterone's gone now, so they're able to start rising, okay? Progesterone is dropping drastically because the corpus luteum is gone now. Estrogen is still low, decreasing. Follicle, this is when the corpus luteum dies, and the uterus, the endometrium dies. Okay, and this is what the menstruation is made up of, is that endometrium. Okay, so that's days 1 through 5. And we move into the proliferative phase, days 5 through 13. Okay, those top 3 hormones are always going to go together. They're higher, right? They're starting to rise. They're much higher than they've been. Okay, progesterone levels are very low because there's no corpus luteum to release it. Estrogen levels are starting to rise, especially towards the end of these 8 days here. Follicle is growing, right? Follicle is getting bigger. Okay, the uterus is also growing. And that little slice there is the graph, right? The graph, we're gonna see the full graph of all that stuff on the end here, but that's what that little thing on the left is. Okay, so that's days 5 through 13. So next we're gonna move right into ovulation. So this is right at day 14, right? So these 3 hormones are surging, right? We get that surge because of the positive feedback from estrogen, right? Progesterone is going to rise immediately after ovulation, not during ovulation, but immediately afterwards. Okay, estrogen levels are as high as they're going to be, and then they're going to drop immediately after ovulation. The follicle here is as large as it's going to be, and it's releasing a lot of estrogen. And the uterus is still growing. It's going to get bigger, but it's still growing. Okay, so that's ovulation, ovulatory phase. And then the last phase here is the secretory or luteal phase. This is days 15 through 28, so the last 2 weeks. Okay, GnRH, LH, FSH, these are all low during this period. Progesterone is inhibiting them, but there is a lot of progesterone because it's coming from the corpus luteum, but it's inhibiting those 3 hormones above. Estrogen levels. We still have some decent amount of estrogen here, not as much as what was happening before ovulation, because it is still being released from the corpus luteum. The follicle is now the corpus luteum. It's just an endocrine organ now, it doesn't have the egg in it anymore. And then that uterus is secreting a lot of mucus, preparing for implantation. Okay. All right, and then that last slide just kind of shows you that full graph all together, which you can find a similar one in your textbook. Looks like a lot of you are still writing, so I'll give you another sec. Okay. Yeah, so this kind of puts all those things together, describes what's going on with each one. So you do see that big drop in estrogen that occurs right after ovulation, but it still stays pretty high because of the corpus luteum. Yeah, and so, yeah, all we have left really is this pregnancy stuff, but we're already a couple minutes over time, so we'll finish that up on, you know what, I need to get that to you guys for the quiz. So, yeah, how about it'll probably just take 2 minutes, so let's just talk about it briefly here. So the fertilized egg implants typically in the upper 1/3 of the uterus, okay? This is sometime around 3 days right after fertilization, okay? The placenta is an interesting organ because it's made up of 2 different humans, right? Only organ that we have that's like that. On the mom side, it's called the decidua. Fetus side is called the chorion, okay? The chorion releases something called chorionic gonadotropin, which is what pregnancy tests test for in the urine, okay? And so it's called HCG is what those pregnancy tests are testing for. But its job is to keep that corpus luteum alive for 2 to 3 months, because normally the corpus luteum is dead in 2 weeks. But instead it stays alive for 2 to 3 months if pregnancy occurs, keeps the endometrium alive and growing. And again, that's what's measured in those pregnancy tests. So that's that HCG hormone. So if pregnancy doesn't happen, that's not released, the corpus luteum dies, the endometrium dies. Okay, these are just our 3 positive pregnancy tests. I like to throw those in there. But yeah, Monique was extremely sick in that one. So very bad. Soren said he could see Christian in there when we found out. So that's what he was looking at. But yeah, so just real briefly on birth control, there's lots of different kinds. Synthetic estrogens are very common. Synthetic progesterones are very common. You could see what estrogen would do because it inhibits FSH and LH. Progesterone, in a way, kind of tricks the body into thinking that it's pregnant, right? Which will stop ovulation and follicle development. Most pills have a combination of these in them now. IUDs are very common these days as well, which is an implanted device like this that pretty much makes implantation impossible. And then this is what you can do to prevent pregnancy later on, tubal ligation. You just go in there and put those clamps on those tubes, similar to the vasectomy in males. So, all right, guys, thanks for hanging in here for a couple more minutes. Have a great day off on Wednesday, and then the lectures will be posted for Friday soon, so feel free to do that whenever you want. And take that quiz. Don't forget to take the quiz on Friday. All right, guys. Happy Easter. Enjoy your little bit of a break.